My name is Sheldon Morgan, and at 67 years old, I thought I had experienced everything life could throw at me. I raised my son Thomas alone after my wife passed, working construction jobs with these calloused hands to give him everything. But nothing prepared me for that dinner when my own flesh and blood looked me in the eyes and said those words that cut deeper than any saw ever could. The silence afterward said everything. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you value family and truth, because this story might just change how you see the relationships in your own life. I was never meant to be anything special in this world, just a regular guy from Michigan who knew how to work hard and stay honest. Construction was my life for 40 years. I still remember my first day on the job site, barely 20 years old, hands smooth and back unbent. By the time I retired, those same hands looked like tanned leather, and my back had the permanent curve of a man who had lifted one too many loads of cement. My wife, Elaine, was the real treasure in my life. We met young, got married at 22, and had Thomas when we were 27. She was a kindergarten teacher, had this way with kids that made me know she was born to be a mother. We weren't rich, but we had a small 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood, and we were making plans. So many plans. Then came that rainy Tuesday in April when Thomas was just 8 years old. Elaine had a headache that morning. I told her to stay home, but she had a classroom full of 5-year-olds waiting for her. By lunchtime, she collapsed. Brain aneurysm, the doctor said. Nothing anyone could have done. Just like that, she was gone, and I became a single father overnight. Those first few months were a blur of grief and confusion. Thomas would wake up crying for his mom, and all I could do was hold him, my own tears mixing with his. I had no idea how to be both mother and father to a little boy. My foreman was understanding enough to let me adjust my hours, but construction work is not known for its flexibility. I had to be on site when the crew needed me, so I made sacrifices. I turned down the supervisor position that would have meant more money but also more hours away from home. I stopped hanging out with the guys after work. I learned to cook something besides burgers and hot dogs. I sat through parent-teacher conferences and helped with homework I barely understood myself. I became the dad who showed up to everything, even if it meant losing sleep. Money was always tight. I remember this one Christmas when Thomas was 10. He had his heart set on this fancy electronic game system all the kids wanted. Cost nearly $300, which might as well have been $3,000 to me back then. I picked up weekend jobs for 2 months straight, helping a buddy with his roofing business. When Thomas unwrapped that present on Christmas morning, the look on his face made every sore muscle worth it. Thomas was a good kid growing up. Smart too, much smarter than his old man. He got mostly as in school without much pushing from me. But I noticed something as he entered his teenage years. He became very aware of what we didn't have. The first time he came home from a new friend's house in the wealthy part of town, he was quiet all evening. Finally, he asked why we couldn't have a big house with a pool like his friend Jack. That stung. But I explained that different families have different resources and that we were doing just fine with what we had. By the time he reached high school, Thomas had developed expensive tastes. He wanted designer clothes, the newest phone, all the things his wealthier friends had. I tried to teach him the value of money, made him work summer jobs so he could understand what things cost in terms of hours worked. Sometimes the lessons stuck, sometimes they didn't. When Thomas got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I was bursting with pride. No one in my family had ever gone to college before. I had saved what I could for his education, working extra shifts whenever they were available, but it was nowhere near enough for 4 years of tuition. We cobbled together loans and grants, and Thomas worked part-time at the campus bookstore. It was during those college years that I felt him really start to drift away. He joined a fraternity his sophomore year, full of kids from money. His calls home became less frequent. When he did call, he talked about parties on private boats and spring break trips to tropical islands, things I could never provide. I told myself this was normal, that he was finding his own path in life, but there was always this nagging worry that he was ashamed of where he came from, of me. Then, in his senior year, he met Amanda Peterson. Thomas called me one night, more excited than I had heard him in years. He had met this amazing girl in his economics class, smart and beautiful, and from a prominent family in Boston. The Petersons, it turned out, were old money. Harold Peterson ran a successful investment firm that had been in the family for 3 generations. His wife, Judith, was on the board of several major charitable foundations. They had a summer home in Martha's Vineyard and traveled to Europe twice a year. When Thomas brought Amanda home to meet me that Thanksgiving, I cleaned my little house until it shined and cooked the best meal I could manage. Amanda was polite, with perfect manners and a dazzling smile, but I could see her taking in my modest living room, the worn furniture, the simple decorations. There was nothing unkind in her manner, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel like my whole life was being assessed and found somewhat lacking. The first time I met Harold and Judith Peterson was at a dinner they hosted at their Boston home. It was the kind of place you see in magazines, with rooms bigger than my entire first floor. Harold was a tall man with silver hair and the confidence of someone who has never worried about money a day in his life. He shook my hand firmly and asked about my work with what seemed like genuine interest. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice the subtle condescension. When I mentioned being in construction, Harold commented that he had just completed a major renovation on their vacation property, speaking about his contractor in the same tone one might use to discuss a reliable but simple tool. When I shared a story about a challenging project I had managed, he nodded politely but quickly steered the conversation back to Thomas's future prospects, as if my past achievements were merely quaint anecdotes. I tried to connect with them. I really did. I asked about their business, their travels, their perspectives on current events. They answered cordially but never asked much in return. By dessert, I felt invisible, included only because I happened to be the father of the young man their daughter had chosen. Still, I smiled and thanked them for their hospitality. For Thomas's sake, I wanted this relationship to work. Thomas and Amanda got engaged after dating for 18 months. The ring he gave her cost more than my truck. I never asked where he got the money for it, but I had my suspicions about Harold's involvement. The wedding planning began immediately, with Judith Peterson taking charge as if conducting a military operation. I offered to contribute what I could financially, which wasn't much on my construction worker's pension. Harold pulled me aside at one of the early planning dinners and patted my shoulder. "Don't worry about the costs, Sheldon," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We want to give Amanda the wedding she deserves. Just show up and enjoy yourself." The implication was clear. This was their show, and I was merely a spectator. The wedding was held at an historic estate outside Boston, with 300 guests, most of whom I had never met. The cost of the flowers alone probably exceeded what I made in 3 months. I rented a tuxedo that felt stiff and foreign on my body, and stood awkwardly through the cocktail hour making small talk with strangers who seemed to all know each other from yacht clubs and charity galas. During the reception, Harold gave a toast that lasted nearly 15 minutes. He spoke eloquently about legacy and potential, about Amanda and Thomas representing the union of 2 exceptional families. When he referenced me, it was brief. And to Sheldon, who raised Thomas as a single father under difficult circumstances, "We welcome you to our extended family." That was it. My entire contribution to raising my son summed up as difficult circumstances to be overcome. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper where I had written my thoughts. I spoke from the heart about watching Thomas grow, about the pride I felt seeing the man he had become, about my hopes for his and Amanda's happiness. I told a few simple stories from his childhood that made Thomas smile. When I finished after barely 4 minutes, the applause felt polite but tepid. I caught Thomas glancing at some of Amanda's relatives, looking slightly embarrassed. That was the moment I first truly understood that my son had crossed into a world where I would always be an outsider. After the honeymoon in the Maldives, Thomas and Amanda moved into a beautiful colonial-style house in an upscale neighborhood. Harold had helped with the down payment as a wedding gift, which I later learned meant he had paid for 70% of the house outright. I brought them a housewarming gift of handmade wooden picture frames I had crafted in my workshop. Amanda thanked me and placed them on a side table in the guest room. Thomas had studied business administration in college, with plans to go into marketing. But within 2 months of the wedding, he was working for Peterson Investments. Harold had created a special position for him, with the title Director of New Market Development. When I asked Thomas what exactly he did, his explanation was vague but impressive sounding. The salary, however, was crystal clear, more than I had ever made, even in my best years as a senior construction worker. The changes in Thomas happened gradually, but steadily. His speech patterns shifted, adopting the clipped, confident tones of his father-in-law. He began dropping references to golf games with clients, wine tastings, and charity fundraisers. He bought a luxury car that cost more than all the vehicles I had owned in my lifetime combined. When I commented on it, he brushed it off. "It is important to project success in my position, Dad." Our usual Sunday phone calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When I suggested meeting for lunch halfway between our homes, Thomas was always too busy with work commitments or social obligations with the Petersons. "Maybe next month," became his standard response, but next month never seemed to arrive. When we did get together, the distance between us felt more than geographic. Thomas would check his phone constantly, responding to texts and emails, as if whatever was happening elsewhere was infinitely more important than our conversation. He asked perfunctory questions about my life, but showed little interest in my answers. Instead, he would steer the conversation toward tales of Harold's business acumen or the Petersons' latest social triumph. 6 months after the wedding, I attended a cocktail party at Thomas and Amanda's house. It was my first time meeting most of their new friends, couples in their early 30s who all seemed to work in finance or law. I made an effort to fit in, wearing my best shirt and slacks, recently purchased for the occasion. As I was talking to one of Thomas's colleagues about the housing market, offering insights from my years in construction, I overheard Thomas nearby. "My dad," he was saying to an elegant woman in a black dress. "He means well, but he is a bit simple in his worldview. Construction worker his whole life." There was something apologetic in his tone, as if my occupation was something to be excused rather than respected. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and hurt, but I pretended not to hear and excused myself to get another drink. Later that evening, Amanda's parents arrived fashionably late. The entire atmosphere of the party shifted with their entrance, as if royalty had arrived. Harold moved through the room with practiced charm, dispensing business advice and witty observations. I watched as Thomas followed him like a shadow, laughing too loudly at his jokes, nodding earnestly at his pronouncements. When Harold placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and introduced him to someone as my new right hand at the firm, brilliant young man, the naked pride and pleasure on my son's face made my heart sink. I had never seen him look at me that way. The comparisons began subtly at first. "Harold says the market is going to turn next quarter," Thomas would mention during our increasingly rare conversations. Or, "Harold thinks German cars are superior to Japanese models in the luxury segment." Small things, but the implication was always clear. Harold's opinions were authoritative, worth repeating and respecting. Then the comparisons became more direct. When I suggested a restaurant for dinner during one of my visits, Thomas frowned slightly. "Harold took us to this amazing steakhouse last week. Maybe we should go there instead. You would learn what a real prime cut tastes like. The real stung like a paper cut, small but surprisingly painful." Amanda reinforced this dynamic in her own way. "You should see Harold's workshop, Sheldon," she said once when I mentioned a woodworking project I was doing. "He has every tool imaginable. Maybe he could give you some pointers sometime." The condescension was wrapped in a veneer of helpfulness that made it impossible to object to without seeming oversensitive. I tried to maintain our relationship despite the hurt. I called regularly, sent thoughtful cards on birthdays and anniversaries, and always made myself available whenever Thomas suggested getting together, no matter how last minute the invitation. I told myself that this phase would pass, that eventually Thomas would remember the values I had raised him with and recognize the hollow nature of the world he was so eagerly embracing. But the criticism of my lifestyle became more frequent and less veiled. Thomas made comments about my modest ranch house needing updating and suggested I should consider moving to a better neighborhood. When I drove to visit them in my 5-year-old Ford pickup, he asked me to park it around the corner rather than in their driveway. "The neighbors are a bit particular about the street's appearance," he explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "Christmas, That first year after the wedding was especially difficult. Thomas and Amanda invited me to join them at the Petersons' mansion for the holiday. I brought carefully wrapped gifts I had selected with thought. A handcrafted wooden jewelry box for Amanda, a leather-bound edition of Thomas's favorite childhood book, small tokens for Harold and Judith. The Peterson home was decorated like a department store display, with a 12-foot tree covered in coordinated ornaments and professional-looking garlands draped along the grand staircase. The gift exchange made me feel like an outsider in my son's life. Harold and Judith gave Thomas and Amanda a week at a ski chalet in Aspen and matching designer watches. Thomas received monogrammed cufflinks from Amanda and gave her a diamond necklace in return. I watched as they exclaimed over each lavish gift, my own modest presents still sitting unopened at the side of the enormous tree. When Thomas finally opened my gift, he smiled politely and thanked me, but quickly set it aside without showing it to the others. Amanda made appropriate noises of appreciation for her jewelry box, but seemed confused by its handmade nature. "Is it an antique?" she asked, and I had to explain that I had made it myself. "How rustic," Judith commented with a tight smile. After dinner, while Amanda and Judith were in the kitchen organizing dessert, Harold cornered me in the study. "Sheldon," he said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly pension, "I wanted to have a word with you, man to man." He sipped his expensive scotch and regarded me over the rim of the glass. "I understand your financial situation is modest. I would be happy to help set you up with something more comfortable. For Thomas's sake." The offer was made with such casual arrogance that it took me a moment to process. Harold Peterson was offering me charity, as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. "Thank you," I said carefully, "but I am comfortable with what I have earned through my own efforts." Harold looked genuinely perplexed. "There is no shame in accepting help, Sheldon. Pride is a luxury for those who can afford it." He chuckled at his own wit. "Some things are worth more than money," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Self-respect is one of them." Harold shrugged as if my response was both expected and disappointing. "Suit yourself, but the offer remains open." Later that evening, I overheard Thomas and Harold talking in the hallway. "Dad turned down your offer?" Thomas sounded incredulous. "That is just his stubborn pride talking. He has always been that way, refusing help even when he needs it." "It is an admirable quality, in its way," Harold responded, "but rather impractical. Perhaps you can help him see reason." Thomas found me later as I was preparing to leave. "Dad, why would you turn down Harold's help? He was just trying to be generous." "I do not need his charity, Thomas. I have everything I need. But you could have so much more. A nicer place. Maybe even some investments to grow your savings. Why are you so resistant to improving your situation?" "There is nothing wrong with my situation," I said quietly. "I have earned every part of the life I live, and I am proud of that." Thomas gave me a look of frustrated pity. "This is exactly what I mean. Harold says that kind of thinking keeps people from advancing in life. Sometimes you have to accept a helping hand to get to the next level." In that moment, I realized that my son no longer saw me as someone to emulate or respect. I had become a project, a problem to solve, an embarrassing reminder of a background he was trying to leave behind. The revelation sat like a stone in my chest all the way home. 3 months after that Christmas, I decided to invite Thomas and Amanda to my home for dinner. I had not seen them since the holidays, despite several attempts to arrange a get-together. Finally, Thomas agreed to a Saturday evening meal at my place, though he sounded less than enthusiastic about the prospect. I spent the entire week preparing. I cleaned every inch of my modest house, even repainting the guest bathroom and replacing the worn welcome mat at the front door. I researched recipes online, wanting to prepare something impressive but within my culinary abilities. I settled on roast beef with garlic mashed potatoes and asparagus, buying the best cuts of meat I could afford, and practicing the recipe twice to ensure it would come out perfectly. I even purchased new dinnerware, replacing my mismatched plates with a simple but elegant white set. I bought a decent bottle of red wine on the recommendation of the store clerk, though the price made me wince. The total cost of the evening was more than I usually spent on groceries in 2 weeks, but I told myself it was worth it for the chance to reconnect with my son. Thomas and Amanda were scheduled to arrive at 6. By 6:30, there was still no sign of them. I called Thomas's cell phone twice, getting his voicemail both times. Finally, at 10 minutes to 7, I heard the sound of tires on my gravel driveway. I looked out the window to see Thomas's luxury sedan pulling up, its glossy surface looking strangely out of place next to my weathered mailbox. They entered with a flurry of explanations and half apologies. Traffic was absolutely dreadful, Amanda said, though there rarely was traffic in my quiet rural area. And we came directly from brunch at the Whitakers, Thomas added, naming what I assumed was another wealthy family in their social circle. It ran much longer than expected. The implication was clear. My dinner invitation had been sandwiched between more important engagements. I swallowed my hurt and welcomed them warmly, taking their coats and offering drinks. Thomas glanced around my living room with a barely concealed expression of assessment, his eyes lingering on the worn armchair I had owned since his childhood. "You still have that old thing?" he asked with a small laugh. "I remember when you first bought it. Must be 20 years ago now." 23, I corrected gently. Still the most comfortable seat in the house. Amanda wandered to my window, looking out at the quiet street. "Your neighborhood is so quaint," she said, using the same tone someone might use to describe a mildly interesting museum exhibit. "Though I would be concerned about property values in this area. Harold says this region has not seen appreciable growth in years." I bit back a response about how not everything needs to appreciate in value to be worthwhile, and instead invited them to the dining room. The table was set as nicely as I could manage, with my new plates, cloth napkins, and a small arrangement of flowers from my garden. I had even found an old pair of candlesticks in the attic, which now stood in the center of the table with fresh tapers. "How nice," Amanda said with the automatic politeness of someone acknowledging a child's artwork. Thomas said nothing, already checking something on his phone. Dinner began awkwardly but civilly. I served the roast beef, which had come out reasonably well, along with the sides. Amanda took small, bird-like bites, while Thomas ate with distracted efficiency. I tried to engage them in conversation, asking about their work and lives. "How are things at the firm?" I asked Thomas, genuinely interested in his career despite my misgivings about Harold's influence. "Busy," he replied vaguely. "We are working on some significant portfolio restructuring that Harold thinks will position us well for the next quarter." "That sounds interesting," I prompted. "What does that involve exactly?" Thomas gave me a look that suggested I could not possibly understand. "It is complex, Dad. Financial strategies that require a certain expertise to appreciate." Before I could respond, Amanda jumped in. "We should tell your father about Aspen, Thomas. It was absolutely magical." What followed was 20 minutes of detailed descriptions of the Petersons' most recent family vacation, the private ski instructor who had once trained Olympic athletes, the 5-star resort with its world-class spa, the exclusive restaurants where Harold was treated like visiting royalty. I nodded and smiled, asking appropriate questions while feeling increasingly irrelevant to their world. When there was finally a lull in the vacation narrative, I attempted to share my own news. "I have been thinking about my retirement plans," I said, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice. "I might take a part-time position as a consultant on residential projects. The extra income would let me travel a bit, maybe see some of the national parks I have always wanted to visit." "Consultant?" Thomas repeated with raised eyebrows. "What kind of consulting could a construction worker do?" The dismissive tone stung, but I kept my expression neutral. There's a lot of knowledge that comes with 40 years in the industry. Younger contractors sometimes appreciate guidance on complicated structural issues or dealing with difficult clients. Thomas made a non-committal sound and exchanged a glance with Amanda that clearly communicated their assessment of my plans as unimpressive. "Sounds very sensible," he said finally, in the same tone one might use to describe a particularly boring mutual fund. "Harold is planning an entirely different kind of retirement," Amanda offered, effectively changing the subject. "He is looking at purchasing a small vineyard in Napa. As a hobby, you know. Though he says with his business connections, he could probably turn it into quite a profitable venture." That sounds expensive, I observed mildly. Well, when you have built the kind of success Harold has, you earn certain privileges, Thomas said with a hint of defensiveness. His retirement plans can be more ambitious because his career was more ambitious. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Unlike yours. I took a sip of water, letting the moment pass rather than confronting it directly. The conversation turned to Thomas's recent promotion at Harold's firm. He had been made Senior Director of Strategic Investments after barely a year with the company. A meteoric rise that seemed suspiciously accelerated to me. That is quite an achievement, I said carefully. It must involve a lot of responsibility. It does, Thomas confirmed, straightening slightly in his chair. Harold has essentially put me in charge of a $100 million portfolio. He says I have a natural instinct for market opportunities. Did you have experience in that area before joining the firm? I asked, genuinely curious about my son's qualifications for such a significant role. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. What are you suggesting, Dad? Nothing at all, I assured him. Just trying to understand your work better. I am proud of you and want to know more about what you do. It sounds like you are implying I did not earn my position, Thomas said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from his teenage years when he felt unfairly criticized. That is not what I meant, I began. But Thomas was already building momentum. Just because I chose a different path than manual labor does not make my career less legitimate, he continued, his voice rising slightly. Not everyone wants to swing a hammer their whole lives. Amanda placed a hand on his arm, murmuring something that sounded like darling. Not now. But Thomas shook her off. I know you never understood ambition, Dad. You were always content to stay exactly where you were, doing exactly the same thing year after year, and that is fine for you. But I wanted more. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the pain of being fundamentally misunderstood by my own child. Thomas, your mother and I always encouraged you to follow your dreams. I never expected you to follow my path. But there is a difference between ambition and... A difference between ambition and what? Thomas challenged, now fully agitated. Success? Is that it? Are you uncomfortable with my success because it highlights your lack of it? Thomas, Amanda gasped, looking mortified. I kept my voice level with effort. Success can be measured in many ways, son. Not all of them involve money or titles. Thomas gave a short, derisive laugh. That is exactly what people say when they have failed to achieve either. Harold built something remarkable from what his father left him. He took risks, made bold moves, created real wealth and influence. Meanwhile, you just existed, comfortable in your mediocrity. The words hit like physical blows, but I maintained my composure. I raised a son on my own after your mother died. I put food on the table, kept a roof over our heads, and made sure you had opportunities I never had, including the education that eventually connected you with the Petersons. I do not consider that mediocrity. Please, Thomas scoffed. Harold was running a multi-million-dollar firm while raising 2 daughters. He managed to build a legacy while being a father. You act like doing the absolute minimum deserves some kind of medal. I felt heat rising in my face, not from anger, but from a deep, profound hurt. The absolute minimum would have been walking away. Plenty of men do. I stayed and did my best for you. Thomas stood suddenly, his napkin falling to the floor. His face was flushed with emotion, eyes bright with a mixture of anger and something else I could not quite identify. Perhaps it was the need to justify his own choices, to paint my life as a failure in order to frame his new path as the correct one. Your best? He said, voice rising to a shout. Your best was a small house in a forgotten neighborhood and a life of watching other people build things while you hammered nails. Harold created a financial empire. He provides for his family in ways you could never even imagine. You are not even half the man my father-in-law is. The dining room fell silent. Amanda looked mortified, staring down at her barely touched plate. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as if this moment had been inevitable from the first time Thomas set foot in the Petersons' world. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood slowly, meeting my son's gaze directly. Good, I said quietly but clearly. Then go live with him. Thomas blinked, the rage in his expression giving way to confusion. What? If Harold Peterson is your model of what a man and a father should be, then by all means, make him your father in more than just law. But do not come to my table and insult the life I built for us, the sacrifices I made for you." Thomas stared at me, momentarily speechless. The room went completely still as the meaning of my words sank in. I was not fighting back with anger or defensiveness. I was simply acknowledging the choice he had already made. Amanda looked between us, her discomfort palpable. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it again, then seemed to deflate slightly. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of recognition at what he had said, and what it revealed about how far he had traveled from the values I had tried to instill in him. But the moment passed quickly. Thomas straightened his shoulders and adopted an expression of wounded dignity. "I think we should go," he said to Amanda, who nodded quickly and began gathering her purse and phone. I did not argue or try to stop them. I simply nodded and said, "That might be best." As they moved toward the door, Thomas paused for a moment, perhaps waiting for me to apologize or try to smooth things over as I had so many times before. But this time, I remained silent. Some lines, once crossed, changed the landscape permanently. The sound of the front door closing behind them echoed through my empty house, followed by the purr of the luxury car's engine fading into the distance. I stood alone in my dining room, looking at the remains of the meal I had prepared with such care and hope, feeling a complex mixture of sadness, anger, and surprisingly, relief. At least now the pretense was over. After Thomas and Amanda left, I did not immediately clear the table or clean the kitchen. Instead, I sat back down in my chair and poured myself another glass of wine. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old structure had paused out of respect for the moment. I had known for some time that Thomas and I were growing apart, but I had not expected such a complete rejection of everything I represented. His words echoed in my mind. "You are not even half the man my father-in-law is." What hurt most was not the comparison itself, but the realization that my son had so thoroughly absorbed values so different from those I had tried to teach him. Sacrifice, honesty, hard work, integrity. These were the principles I had built my life around. They were not flashy or particularly rewarding in material terms, but they had guided me through the darkest periods of my life and given me a sense of purpose after Elaine died. Somehow, I had failed to pass these values on to Thomas, or perhaps the allure of wealth and status had simply proven too powerful to resist. As I sat there in the growing darkness, memories of raising Thomas flooded back. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, his face a mixture of determination and fear as I jogged alongside, gradually letting go. I thought about the countless evenings spent at the kitchen table helping with homework, my own education limited but my patience unlimited. I recalled sitting in cold bleachers watching his Little League games, working double shifts to pay for summer camp, the pride in his face when he got his college acceptance letter. Where had it all gone wrong? Had I been too focused on providing materially, not realizing that Thomas was forming a different set of values in the vacuum left by my long work hours? Or was this simply who he had always been, and the Petersons had merely given him access to the world he had always secretly coveted? The week following our confrontation passed without any contact from Thomas. No call, no text, not even an email. Each day, I checked my phone with diminishing hope, telling myself that he just needed time to cool off, to reflect on what had happened. But as the days stretched into a second week, I began to accept that the rupture between us might be more permanent than I had initially allowed myself to believe. During that quiet period, I found myself spending more time with my old friend Jack, who lived a few streets over. Jack and I had worked construction together for nearly 20 years before he injured his back and moved into an office role with the company. We had drifted apart somewhat in recent years, but now I found myself dropping by his place regularly, sometimes just to sit on his porch and share a beer in companionable silence. "Heard anything from Thomas?" Jack asked during one of these visits, about 10 days after the dinner incident. I shook my head, peeling the label from my beer bottle with my thumb. "Not a word." Jack nodded thoughtfully. He was one of the few people who knew the whole story of Thomas's transformation since marrying into the Peterson family. Kids can be real puzzles sometimes, he said finally. My daughter went through a phase in her 30s where she barely spoke to me and Sandra. Lasted almost 2 years. Now we talk every other day, and she brings the grandkids over twice a week. What changed? I asked, hoping for some insight I could apply to my own situation. Jack shrugged his broad shoulders. Life has a way of showing people what really matters. For Lisa, it was when Sandra got sick. Suddenly, all the petty grievances and differences of opinion did not seem so important anymore. He took a thoughtful sip of his beer. Thomas might need something like that. Not illness, mind you, but some kind of reality check. I considered Jack's words carefully. I keep wondering if I could have done things differently. Maybe if I had pushed harder for him to stay in marketing instead of joining Harold's firm, or if I had been more direct about my concerns earlier. Sheldon, Jack said with the frankness of an old friend, you cannot control how another person thinks or acts, even your own kid, especially your own kid sometimes. You did your best with what you had. If Thomas cannot see that, the problem is not with your parenting, it is with his perspective. Those conversations with Jack were healing in their way, but I still found myself lying awake many nights, mentally composing letters to Thomas that I never wrote down. In these imaginary communications, I tried to articulate all the things I wished I had said over the years, how proud I was of his achievements, how I supported his ambitions, even when they took him far from my world, but also how I worried that he was defining success in terms that would ultimately leave him empty. During the 3rd week of silence, I actually did start writing a letter to Thomas. It took me several evenings, drafting and redrafting, trying to find words that would bridge the gulf between us without either apologizing for values I still believed in or attacking choices he had made. The finished product was 4 pages long, handwritten on lined paper from an old notebook. Dear Thomas, it began, there are things I need to say to you, father to son, that got lost somewhere along the way. First, I am proud of you, not because of your job title or your address or the car you drive, but because of the determination and intelligence you have always shown. These qualities come from within you, not from any external validation. I went on to acknowledge the ways I might have failed him as a father, the limitations of my perspective, the mistakes made with good intentions. But I also gently challenged the values he now seemed to embrace so wholeheartedly. True wealth, I wrote toward the end, is not measured in dollars or possessions or social status. It is measured in relationships that sustain us through hard times, in work that brings genuine satisfaction, in the knowledge that we have lived according to our deepest principles. I worry that in your rush to acquire the trappings of success, you might be sacrificing the foundations of happiness. I signed it simply, Love always, Dad, folded the pages carefully, and placed them in an envelope with Thomas's name on the front. Then I put the envelope in my bedside drawer rather than mailing it. Something told me the timing was not right, that words alone could not bridge the distance between us. Or perhaps I was simply afraid of another rejection, this time in written form. As the silence between us stretched into its 4th week, I began to accept that our relationship might never return to what it had been. People change, priorities shift, and sometimes the bonds we assume are unbreakable prove to be more fragile than we imagined. I started focusing more on my own life, reconnecting with old friends, volunteering at the local Veterans Center, spending more time in my workshop. I would always love my son, but I could not put my entire emotional life on hold waiting for him to remember that he loved me too. It was a Saturday afternoon in early May, nearly a month after our confrontation at dinner. I was in my backyard garden, planting tomato seedlings in the raised beds I had built years ago when Thomas was still in high school. The day was warm but not hot, with the kind of gentle breeze that makes outdoor work pleasant rather than punishing. I was so absorbed in the task, carefully placing each fragile plant and patting the soil around its base, that I did not hear the car pull up or the gate open. Dad? The voice startled me, causing me to drop the trowel I was holding. I looked up to see Thomas standing awkwardly at the edge of the garden. He was dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, a stark contrast to the tailored business attire or designer casual wear I had grown accustomed to seeing him in. Something about his posture reminded me of when he was a teenager coming home past curfew, a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. I straightened slowly, brushing soil from my hands onto my work pants. "Thomas," I said, neither a question nor an exclamation, just a simple acknowledgement of his presence. "This is a surprise." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around the garden, as if gathering his thoughts. "I was in the area," he said finally, though we both knew this was unlikely given the distance between his home and mine. "Thought I would stop by." I nodded, accepting the fiction for what it was, an attempt to make this visit seem casual rather than the significant step it represented. "I was just about to take a break," I said. "Would you like some iced tea?" Thomas nodded, and I led the way to the small wooden table and chairs on the patio, another project I had built with my own hands years ago. We sat across from each other, two grown men suddenly awkward in each other's presence despite sharing the same blood. I poured tea from the pitcher I had brought out earlier, the ice long since melted but the drink still cool. For several minutes, we engaged in the most stilted small talk I had ever experienced with my son. Comments about the weather, observations about the garden, vague references to current events. Finally, when the pretense became too exhausting to maintain, Thomas set down his glass with more force than necessary and met my gaze directly. "Things are not going well at work," he said abruptly. I raised my eyebrows but said nothing, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "Harold." Thomas paused, seeming to struggle with how to frame whatever he needed to say. "Harold has certain expectations, very specific expectations, about how things should be done, about my role in the company, about everything." I nodded, still not speaking, sensing that my son needed to unburden himself without interruption. "At first, it seemed like a dream opportunity," he continued, staring down at his hands on the table. "Director-level position right out of the gate, impressive salary, respect from everyone in the firm because I was Harold Peterson's son-in-law. But there are strings attached. So many strings." He looked up at me, a flicker of the vulnerability I remembered from his childhood crossing his face. "Harold does not just control the business aspects. He has opinions about where Amanda and I should live, what car I should drive, even where we should vacation. When we bought the house, he insisted on approving the neighborhood. When I wanted to buy Amanda a birthday gift, he suggested the jeweler we should use. It is like he sees us as extensions of himself rather than independent adults." I took a slow sip of my tea, considering my response carefully. "That must be difficult," I said finally, keeping my tone neutral. Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is an understatement. And lately, there have been other issues. Things at the firm that make me uncomfortable." "What kind of things?" I asked, genuine concern overriding my determination to let him lead the conversation. Thomas lowered his voice slightly, though there was no one else around to hear. "Ethical gray areas. Nothing explicitly illegal, but practices that skirt very close to the line. Favors for friends that look a lot like conflicts of interest. Client funds allocated in ways that benefit Harold's associates. Documentation that gets created after the fact to justify decisions already made." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache with remembered affection. When I tried to raise concerns, Harold brushed me off, said I was being naive, that this is how the real world of finance operates. Then he reminded me, very smoothly but very clearly, that my position exists at his pleasure. "Sounds like a difficult situation," I observed, still careful not to push too hard or appear judgmental. "What does Amanda think about all this?" Thomas sighed heavily. "She is caught in the middle. Harold is her father, and she has always idolized him. She cannot imagine him doing anything truly wrong, but she also sees how stressed I have been, how the job is affecting me. We have been arguing about it for weeks." I nodded, understanding the complexity of his position. "And what do you want to do about it?" "That is just it," Thomas said, frustration evident in his voice. "I do not know what to do. If I leave the firm, Harold will see it as a betrayal. It could damage my marriage, my relationship with Amanda's whole family. But if I stay, I might end up involved in practices that go against everything I actually believe in." The irony of his predicament was not lost on me, but I kept that observation to myself. Instead, I simply listened as Thomas continued to talk, gradually revealing more details about the increasingly suffocating relationship with Harold and the moral compromises he was being asked to make at the firm. As he spoke, I noticed something I had not seen in years. My son was actually talking to me as an equal, as someone whose life experience might offer valuable perspective rather than as an embarrassing relic of his humble origins. The realization both warmed and saddened me, that it had taken this crisis for him to remember that I might have something worthwhile to contribute to his life. "I keep thinking about this client," Thomas was saying, deep into his account of the troubling patterns at Peterson Investments. Elderly woman, widowed, investing her late husband's life insurance to support herself through retirement. Harold moved her money into these high-risk, high-fee investments that primarily benefited the firm, not her. "When I objected," he said, and I quote, "she will be dead before it matters anyway." That was when I really started to see. Thomas trailed off, his attention suddenly caught by something in the garden behind me. "Is that the same strawberry patch?" he asked, his tone shifting completely. "The one we planted when I was in middle school?" I turned to look at the neat rows of strawberry plants along the eastern edge of the garden. "The descendants of it," I confirmed. "I replant a section each year to keep it producing well. But yes, same location, same variety." A small smile, the first genuine one I had seen from him in over a year, appeared on Thomas's face. "I remember how excited I was when we harvested the first berries. You let me eat them right there in the garden, still warm from the Sunday. Said they would never taste better than in that moment, picked by the person who grew them. You remember that?" I asked, surprised and touched that this small moment had stayed with him through all the years and changes. "I remember more than you might think, Dad," he said quietly. "Lately, I have been remembering a lot of things." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotions, before Thomas continued in a more reflective tone. "You know, all this time I have been chasing what I thought was success. The title, the salary, the house in the right neighborhood, the right connections. I thought that was what it meant to be successful, to be a man of substance." He shook his head slowly. "But lately I have been wondering if I have been measuring the wrong things all along." "How so?" I prompted gently. "Harold has all the trappings of success, everything I thought I wanted, but he does not seem happy or at peace with himself. He is constantly worried about status, about what others think, about maintaining his position, and he treats people as means to an end, not as human beings with their own dignity." Thomas looked directly at me. "You never did that. Even when we had so little, you treated everyone with respect. The mailman, my teachers, your co-workers, everyone." I felt a swell of emotion, but kept my expression steady. This was Thomas's moment of reflection, not mine to claim or direct. "I have been so focused on what Harold could give me that I never stopped to consider what accepting those gifts was costing me," he continued. "My independence, my integrity, my self-respect." He paused, then added more softly, "My relationship with you." "Thomas," I said, finally breaking my pattern of minimal responses, "everyone makes choices in life, based on what they value most at the time. Sometimes we do not recognize the true cost of those choices until later. The important thing is what you do with that recognition once you have it." "What would you do?" he asked, and the question contained no trace of the dismissiveness or condescension that had characterized so many of our recent interactions. He was genuinely seeking my counsel, father to son. I took my time answering, wanting to offer something of real value rather than easy platitudes. "I cannot tell you exactly what to do in your specific situation, but I can tell you what has guided me through difficult decisions in my own life." I leaned forward slightly, emphasizing my words. "Ask yourself this. When you look back on this moment 10, 20, 30 years from now, which choice will allow you to face yourself in the mirror with pride rather than regret? Which path aligns with the man you actually want to be, not the man others expect you to be?" Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "I used to know exactly who I wanted to be," he said. "Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that." "It is never too late to remember," I told him, "and it is never too late to change course." We talked for hours that afternoon, moving from the patio to the living room when the day began to cool, sharing thoughts and memories and perspectives in a way we had not done since Thomas was in high school. There were difficult moments of honesty, admissions of disappointment and hurt on both sides. But beneath it all ran a current of something I had feared was gone forever: mutual respect and genuine affection. As evening approached, Thomas stood reluctantly to leave. "I should get back. Amanda will be wondering where I am." I nodded, walking him to the door. Before opening it, Thomas turned to face me, his expression serious but open. "Dad, I am sorry for what I said at dinner that night, for a lot of things." "I know, son," I said simply. "So am I." He hesitated a moment longer, then did something he had not done in years. He hugged me, briefly but firmly. As he pulled away, he said, "I will call you tomorrow. I promise." And as I watched him drive away, I felt something shift inside me, a cautious hope taking root alongside the hard-earned wisdom of my years. Whatever choices Thomas made going forward, I believed that our conversation that day had reminded him of something essential, something that all the wealth and status in the world could not provide: the grounding force of knowing where you come from and what you truly stand for. True to his word, Thomas called the next day, and regularly in the weeks that followed. Our conversations were different now, marked by a new openness and honesty that had been missing for too long. He shared the steps he was taking to address the situation at Peterson Investments, beginning with documenting the questionable practices he had observed and scheduling a private meeting with Harold to discuss his concerns. It did not go well initially, Thomas told me during one of our calls. Harold was furious, said I was being ungrateful and naive, but I stood my ground. "Dad," I told him, that I could not be part of anything that compromised my professional ethics, regardless of family connections. "How did he respond to that?" I asked. "Better than I expected, actually. Once he realized I was serious and would not back down, his tone changed. He suggested we form a compliance committee to review the practices I was concerned about. It might be just for show, but it is a start." At the same time, Thomas began establishing clearer boundaries in his personal relationship with the Petersons. He declined an invitation to their annual Memorial Day weekend at Martha's Vineyard, choosing instead to spend time with Amanda at a small cabin by a lake, disconnected from phones and social expectations. He started making decisions about his home and life without seeking Harold's approval, small acts of independence that gradually shifted the dynamic between them. "Amanda is struggling a bit with the changes," Thomas admitted during one of our fishing trips, an activity we had resumed after more than a decade. "She loves her father and has never seen this side of him before. But she also says she is proud of me for standing up for what I believe in." The real test came 2 months after our reconciliation, when Harold offered Thomas a significant promotion within the firm to Executive Vice President of Client Relations. The position came with a substantial salary increase, a corner office, and considerably more prestige. It also would have tied Thomas even more tightly to Harold's influence and expectations. I turned it down, Thomas told me over dinner at my house, Amanda beside him nodding in support. I told Harold I appreciated the offer, but that I had decided to return to my original career path in marketing. "How did he take it?" I asked, genuinely curious about Harold's reaction. "Not well at first," Thomas admitted with a wry smile. "There was a lot of talk about wasted opportunities and ungrateful behavior, but eventually, he calmed down enough to listen to my reasons. I think on some level, he might even respect the decision, though he would never admit it." Thomas had already secured a position with a reputable marketing firm, starting at a much lower level than he had been at Peterson Investments, but in a field where his education and natural talents could shine. The salary was considerably less than what he had been making, but as he pointed out, "We have more than enough. We are downsizing the house, selling the second car." Turns out neither of us was particularly happy with all that empty space and those enormous utility bills anyway. The most surprising development came a few weeks later, when Harold contacted me directly and asked to meet for lunch. Curious and somewhat apprehensive, I agreed. We met at a modest but well-regarded restaurant, halfway between our homes, neutral territory for what proved to be a remarkably candid conversation. "You raised a stubborn son," Harold said after we had ordered. his tone somewhere between accusation and reluctant admiration. "He comes by it honestly," I replied with a small smile. Harold studied me thoughtfully, his natural confidence somewhat muted in this setting away from his usual power base. "I misjudged you, Sheldon. I assumed that your simpler lifestyle reflected a lack of ambition or intelligence. I was wrong about that." The admission clearly cost him something, and I acknowledged it with a nod. "We all make assumptions based on our own experiences and values. I probably did the same about you. Thomas speaks differently about you now," Harold continued, with a respect that was missing before. "Whatever you said to him that day at your house, it made an impression. I just reminded him of who he is," I said simply. "The rest was his own doing." We talked for nearly 2 hours, two very different men finding unexpected common ground in our concern for the younger generation. Harold was more complex than I had given him credit for, shaped by his own father's rigid expectations and driven by fears I had never had to contend with. By the time we parted, while I would not call us friends, there was at least a foundation of mutual respect that had been entirely absent before. The greatest joy came 3 months later, when Thomas and Amanda announced they were expecting their first child. The news brought our families together in a way that transcended the tensions and differences that had seemed so insurmountable before. At the celebratory dinner, held at Thomas and Amanda's new, more modest home, Harold and I found ourselves standing side by side at the grill, an unlikely pair of prospective grandfathers. "Never thought we would end up family, did you?" Harold asked with unexpected humor. "Life has a way of surprising us," I agreed, turning the stakes with practiced ease. "They are going to need both of us," Harold observed, nodding toward Thomas and Amanda, who were showing Judith some ultrasound pictures. "Different perspectives, different strengths." "I think you are right about that," I said, finding myself in the unexpected position of agreeing with Harold Peterson. The months that followed brought a gradual healing and reconfiguration of our extended family dynamics. Thomas thrived in his new position, his natural talent for creative problem-solving and relationship building earning him recognition that had nothing to do with family connections. Amanda discovered a passion for early childhood education and began volunteering at a local literacy program. They seemed genuinely happier in their scaled-back lifestyle, more present with each other and more authentic in their choices. As for me, I found myself busier and more fulfilled than I had been in years. Between my part-time consulting work, my volunteer activities, regular visits with Thomas and Amanda, and preparations for my first grandchild, my days were full and purposeful. I even began dating again, a tentative step back into a part of life I had neglected for too long, meeting a kind widow named Eleanor through my volunteer work at the Veterans Center. When my grandson was born, a healthy boy they named James Sheldon Morgan, I experienced a kind of joy I had almost forgotten was possible. Holding that small, perfect child for the first time, I saw in his tiny features echoes of my son, my late wife, and generations stretching backward and forward through time. This was legacy in its truest form, not measured in bank accounts or business empires, but in the continuation of life and the transmission of values that truly matter. One evening, about 6 months after James was born, Thomas came to visit me alone. We sat on my back porch, the summer air warm around us, fireflies beginning to appear in the gathering dusk. "Dad," he said after a comfortable silence, "I have been thinking a lot about becoming a father, about the kind of parent I want to be." He glanced at me, his expression earnest. "I keep coming back to the things you taught me, not so much by what you said, but by how you lived. The consistency, the integrity, the willingness to put my needs above your own. You will find your own way, Thomas," I assured him. "Every parent does." "Maybe," he acknowledged. "But I would like James to grow up with the same sense of security and unconditional love that I had, before I got distracted by things that seemed important but were not." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want to thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. That is what being a father means," I said simply. "You love them through everything, the good choices and the poor ones. You stay present and available, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Thomas nodded, absorbing this like a lesson he wanted to carry forward. You know what Harold told me last week? He said that he wished he had been more like you when his girls were growing up. That he had been so focused on providing material advantages that he missed many of the moments that actually mattered. I raised my eyebrows, genuinely surprised. Harold Peterson said that? Thomas smiled. People can surprise you. I think watching us with James has made him reflect on his own choices. As the evening deepened around us, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment of reconciliation and renewed connection. The painful confrontation at dinner had been necessary, a catalyst for change that mere patience and acceptance could never have accomplished. Sometimes, relationships need to break before they can be rebuilt stronger and truer than before. In the end, the measure of a man is not found in his bank account, his job title, or his social connections. It is found in the lives he touches, the values he embodies, and the love he gives without expectation of return. This is the legacy I hope to leave my son and grandson. Not wealth or status, but the enduring richness of integrity, compassion, and the courage to live according to one's deepest principles, even when doing so comes at a cost. What do you think about the relationship between fathers and sons? Have you ever had to stand up for your values, even when it meant disappointing someone you care about? Leave a comment below, and if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening. And remember that true success is measured not by what you have, but by who you are and how you treat those around you.